Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film What We Do in the Shadows. The mockumentary genre was really big about 10 years ago, mostly because of the influence of Best in Show, and you really couldn't escape it. It was everywhere, but eventually it became too mainstream. Modern Family adopted it, and ever since then, even Christopher Guest himself, who's kind of the forefather of the whole genre, said he wouldn't even do it anymore because it's just played out. But What We Do in the Shadows reinvigorates a genre that I once thought was dead, and probably does the same thing with its subject matter of vampires, because it is a vampire mockumentary. The kind of thing that just hearing that probably turns you off from this movie, but it's a really amazing, hilarious comedy in the best sense of both of the genres. It's very much cares about vampires. It's very well researched. You have each of the characters really represents a different kind of vampire, and you can tell the directors of this film actually care about the subject matter, but at the same time they're really good at taking the piss out of it. And I think it shows like the great things that mockumentaries can do, not just with comedy but with the characters in that comedy. You can laugh harder because you know those characters even better than if a film, had to put them in more of a structured plot. It reinvigorates my love of mockumentary. It kind of makes me look at the pros of that style once again, the disorganizedness of it, but the hilarity of it, and what really just makes a really good comedy funny. Now, What We Do in the Shadows is not the most plot-centric film. I think it's probably one of the least plot-centric films I've seen in the modern era, but it kind of is semi-like Spinal Tap in that, because Spinal Tap is different from the rest of Christopher Guest films. It's not directed by Christopher Guest. Christopher Guest is in it, however. The thing with Spinal Tap is it's just their tour, but that's kind of like the loose plot of it. What We Do in the Shadows probably has less of a plot than that. It's a documentary crew filming 4 vampires who live in a flat together in New Zealand, or it's really a house, but people keep referring to it as a flat. I thought a flat's more of an apartment, but whatever. And it's supposed to film them the 2 months before this big masquerade ball where vampires, werewolves, zombies, and all these various monsters in New Zealand get together and hang out and have a masquerade ball. But that's not really what the film's necessarily about. It's just we get to meet these characters. Some various things happen. They make someone a new vampire. They suck a few people's blood. You meet one of the guy's servants. It's not really like what the film is about. It's how you meet these characters. It's so well defined in that. And I think it reminded me of what the mockumentary genre is really good at. And that's really learning characters. You really have a real connection to them because sometimes they can talk to the camera. Sometimes they can just literally tell you their backstory, which might sound lazy in some regards, but if it's done well, you can really have an attachment to those characters. And you have Jermaine Clement, who's playing Vladislav, who's basically kind of like a Bram Stoker's Dracula, like the Coppola movie, kind of very sexual vampire. And you have Deacon, played by Jonathan Berg, who also is kind of in that vein. He was apparently a vampire Nazi at one time, then found out when World War II was over that people didn't like vampires and they didn't like Nazis, and they especially didn't like Nazi vampires. And then you have Taki Watati, I think, who plays Vigo, who was a dandy back when he lived 300 years ago. He's kind of supposed to represent more of an Anne Rice vampire, and now he's kind of cleaning up and making sure everyone does their chores. And then you have Petier, played by Jonathan Franzen, who doesn't really have a huge part. He's 8,000 years old. He's supposed to be more of the Nosferatu type of vampire. And Deacon actually has a servant who wants to be turned into a vampire so she can have eternal life, but he doesn't really do that for her, so she can do all their chores and do things around the house for them. One of the better things about this film is both how funny it is, and it's extremely hilarious. The kind of film that you'll end up quoting, you'll end up talking about werewolves instead of swearwolves, which is something that Bryce Darby, who is also from Flight of the Conchords, this is a bit of a Flight of the Conchords reunion, except for Brett, because both the directors, Jermaine was in Flight of the Conchords, of course, and Takia directed several episodes, and Bryce Darby, of course, was in Flight of the Conchords also. He's the pack leader of this pack of werewolves. He doesn't like them to swear and says we're werewolves, not swearwolves. And there's lots of incredibly quotable lines, but I think what makes this comedy so rich and so funny and so inviting, and such a film that when I was watching I was like, I bet you this is funnier on the second or third viewing. And that reminded me, honestly, the first time I watched Spinal Tap was the least funniest time I've watched Spinal Tap. As I've watched it more and more and watched it with friends, I fell in love with it more. And that's because I know those characters. Like, once you know them better and you know their tics and everything, it's almost like they become funnier. And What We Do in the Shadows does that excellently well. It almost kind of understands how the mockumentary genre really works and the pros of it, why it would matter to a comedy that we're attached to these characters. But the same kind of deadpan Flight of the Conchords style of comedy that you're used to from these guys. And I think also that it's a horror comedy that doesn't feel like a horror comedy. It reminds me a bit of Shaun of the Dead in that. I watched it with my wife, and she's not someone who likes horror movies at all, but she thought it was really funny and wanted to watch it again, much like Shaun of the Dead. I know lots of people who will watch a good horror comedy who won't watch a horror movie. And I think What We Do in the Shadows has that down very well, but it's also very respectful that they're like referencing all these different kind of vampire stories, having them all live in a flat together. They could have just made them all vampires and made someone a Twilight vampire or something like that, but they don't do that. Like, you can tell they care a lot more. Now, this is based on a short film that was made pre all of that happening, so maybe that's why it did feel like they researched it. That was one of the things about all the Christopher Guest and all the good mockumentaries, is that they really knew their subject matter. They both respect it and understand it in such a way. It's like such dedicated comedic acting that you don't really see from your average comedy, and I think that's what makes this film probably one of the better comedies I've seen in a really long time, and a surprising one. I think that's one reason I'm bringing up the mockumentary thing so much, is because I just didn't think I'd be talking about a good mockumentary this year. That's one of the great things about watching a lot of movies, is being surprised by something, and I think What We Do in the Shadows does that. It's always fun to see like a different style of comedy come back. What We Do in the Shadows brings it back and kind of makes me wonder why we aren't doing it more. It made me think about the pros of it and how you are so invested in these characters, and how knowing these characters helps you get more into it and care more about them. It's easier to laugh at your friends than it is to laugh at some stranger on the street. And there's not many comedies I see nowadays that have the watchability that this movie really does. I've read reviews from people who've seen it several times and talk about how it gets even funnier, and you can tell that that's like coming through the film in a great way. I like how they just set things up so perfectly, but still has that loose mockumentary feel. It does feel like you're watching something, you're like, how exactly is this gonna go? It feels so alien territory the way it's structured. But like everything from having this young vampire go around telling everyone he's a vampire, how that comes back, to like things they referred to in the beginning that come back, or even callback jokes that they set up and then end up being funny because you understand that behavior. This is probably one of the few films I would say is going to be able to cultishly live on, and is going to be something I'm going to recommend to people as a comedy in a way that I haven't recommended a comedy in a while. What I think makes What We Do in the Shadows kind of magical in a way. It really shouldn't exist. I know everybody brings up vampires have really made a comeback with The Girl Walks Home Alone at Night and Only Lovers Left Alive. I'm kind of sick of saying that in reviews, because I think the one thing those two films and this film have in common is they respect vampires, and Twilight never did. What's funny is like this has every reason not to be respectful of vampires. It's a comedy. In a lot of ways, like what they're making fun of isn't exactly the vampire-ness of it. It's the humanity of it. And I think that's what makes it extra funny. They aren't so reliant on the special effects either, which I think makes it extra hilarious. You can really see these actors getting into the roles, complaining about chore wheels and talking about virgin blood and their past relationships and why they're in this flat together and how they became vampires. That's the same thing with like Only Lovers Left Alive or The Girl Who Walks Home Alone at Night. They want to make different kind of vampire movies. And it is interesting how we've had this kind of burst of creativity with smaller films in terms of vampire movies, and how they're all so radically different but uncannily original. And What We Do in the Shadows might actually end up being probably one of my favorite ones. It's definitely up there with Only Lovers Left Alive, and they're both like so unmistakably cool. But I think what is extra cool about this movie is how into its concept and into its style it really is, and how much it cares about it. I think that's one of the things that makes a really good comedy, is when they care about that kind of a comedy, whether it's Airplane or whether it's the Farrelly Brothers or the Marx Brothers or Charlie Chaplin or whoever. When you tell it's done with a lot of care and they understand that genre, it's actually a lot funnier. Part of comedy is you can't believe this is happening, and in a way part of what I like about What We Do in the Shadows is I can't believe I'm watching this kind of a movie. As much as I heard this film was good, my reservations were, oh, it's a vampire mockumentary. I don't know if I'd really want to do that, and it proves itself to me. So all my doubts went away rather quickly because I was laughing too hard to even think about that. This is the kind of cultish comedy that you should be seeking out and laughing and watching at a party, and then watching several times with that same group of friends. It has that infectious energy that you want from a comedy, and it's probably one of the best horror comedies I've seen. Maybe since Shaun of the Dead. I can't really think of another one I've liked this much. It is kind of that kind of a comedy you want to recommend to friends friends and laugh at and quote. And on top of all the different things it's doing, it also, I think, in the end, just really cares about making a funny movie with really great characters in it. If you look at the great comedies in film history, usually they have a great character, but I think What We Do in the Shadows understands that very well and makes it an infectious, well-spirited, and a hilarious comedy that I think I will be enjoying for years. So if you have seen What We Do in the Shadows and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.